All right, everybody be quiet. All right, I told everyone to be quiet. Now we're back. Hey, this is Elliot Fishman. Welcome to our latest Facebook Live. And today is Wednesday. I think it's like the 17th of January, middle of January. The really cold weather has passed and it's coming back and going. But most importantly, if you're smart, you will be going in 5 weeks or so to our meeting. Hopefully I'm holding this in the right place in Orlando. And we have a terrific meeting. Excellent meeting. See it right there. And if you can't make that meeting, we're going to be in Nashville in May. Okay, come to Orlando first. You got both meetings. So this one's on cinematic rendering. And we've written a lot about cinematic rendering. So people keep asking me questions. And so we'll try to answer some of the questions with you today. And the first thing is maybe the best way to get started. I just put 3 cases together. And let me just show you the 3 cases. And I need to go right to my PowerPoint. And here's a case of an intramuscular abscess. You can see very large abscesses in the patient's deltoid muscle. And let's take a look at that with cinematic rendering. And you can see here I have the transparency such that you can see through the muscle, you see the bone, you see the vessels, axillary artery, brachial artery, and its branches. And then I'll just switch over a little bit, and now I'm bringing you the muscle. You can see the increased vascularity. You also can see the decreased attenuation in the muscle. It's amazing what a nice look you also have at the lungs, the ribs, pulmonary arteries, liver, and kidneys within that shot. And then I'll show you a little bit more, giving you a little bit of the induration, infiltration of the muscle, as well as the prominent vascularity in the muscle. And finally, here's a little bit of a different view of that. So you can see very nice detail, bone, vessels, muscle. Another case, this is a patient with a pancreatic mass, spends solid and papillary epithelial neoplasm, cystic and solid lesion tail of pancreas with calcification, nicely shown on the axial and coronal views. There's an incidental hemangioma within the liver seam. So let's look at this with cinematic. Look how nicely you see the lesion. Look at the head and body of the pancreas and the texture, and then you see the textural change in the tail of the pancreas, which is the patient's lesion. You also get a good look at the patient's celiac and SMA. And then I'll just move that along a little bit and now show you another view, again, accentuating the difference in attenuation and appearance between the normal pancreas and the patient's tumor. And Linda Chu has written a very nice article about this. Hopefully will be accepted in AJR soon. Again, a good look at the vessels and the kidney. And then here, that same patient, now I'm just simply changing the parameters, and I'm showing you the vascular map, which would be important preoperative. You see the close relationship of the tumor to the patient's splenic artery. You see the celiac and hepatic and splenic. You see the GDA, off hepatic, and the SMA. Vessels nicely defined. And then here is just one more view where I'm now accentuating a little bit the bowel, the tumor and coronal plane, the stomach and spleen. So you can see the cinematic really takes that simple axial image and adds a lot. We've been looking also at small bowel when Linda finishes this. You can see here the terminal ileum, prominent thickening and enhancement, active Crohn's disease. You can see the coronal of that, and you can see the cinematic rendering appearance with the prominent enhancement of the patient's bowel. And here it is again as I change the parameters. Look how I can accentuate the vessels, the ileocolic branches to the patient's ileum, but look how you can see the inflammation of the terminal ileum, very nicely seen. And then one last set of images, again, changing the parameters. This is a nice visualization, right? Up high, you see the liver, the spleen, the pancreas, celiac and SMA to the ileocolic vessels, the prominent enhancement of the patient's ileum, consistent with active Crohn's disease, and also some of the vessels into the pelvis and some of the bowel in the background. So those are 3 cases which probably provide a good idea or a good look of what we're talking about. So with cinematic, we've been looking at a range of processes. So Where cinematic works out is really in the same areas that classic volume rendering and then supported by MIP work out. So it's really not kind of reinventing the wheel, but perhaps providing a different way of looking at things with more detail. And I think that becomes very, very important for us. So one of the things we look at, and you can see the last two cases, show you how good it is for looking at soft tissue. So you can see specific organs, spleen, liver, kidneys, pancreas. You can see the difference between normal tissue and abnormal tissue. In the same scene, you can see very nice vascular mapping, including the prominent enhancement. So you get a really good feel of looking at that. You also can see the detail of muscle and bone. So we've done a number of different papers looking at specifics, whether it's looking at applications in musculoskeletal or cardiovascular or GI, looking at specific apps like pancreatic cancer, pancreatic masses, perhaps looking at things like patent ductus arteriosus versus dissection, looking at Kawasaki's disease and looking at aneurysms of the coronary arteries. We're looking also at craniofacial. Again, the more complex the problem, the more likely something like cinematic is going to help. So we're really pretty excited about that. Now, one thing, just let me remind people, is we're not quite halfway through the talk, but this is the time you want to ask questions. If you have very specific questions, this is the only time I could really answer them. So it's nice to see a whole bunch of people have logged in, but it would be helpful if people do ask questions, or just sit back and don't ask questions. It's up to you. But with the cinematic, now I didn't have a chance to show you video, so we now can do things on the newest version with, I can make video loops. Before, when you moved, it would always downsample. Now the video kind of sets the sampling and you can get really good looks. And so I find that very helpful. I was showing some cases yesterday to the surgeons, in pancreatic cancer conference. So I'm using cinematic in cases where we're looking at potentially planning surgery. The ability, in this one case we were looking at with a patient with a neuroendocrine tumor, trying to define resectability, it can be proved to be very helpful in that regard. I think we are looking very carefully at how to integrate this in our practice. The good news is the process doesn't take all that long, but it still takes time. You got to figure out in what cases it's going to make a difference. There's no doubt when you show it to a clinician and you say, do you want me to do it? Everyone will answer yes for any and all applications because it does provide a different spin on the process. So I think that's going to be good. We are looking at using things like cinematic as part of the ways of looking at texture of organs. One of the things you can see on the images in front of you, you look at the pancreas, spleen, or liver, you do get a feel of the texture, particularly pancreas and spleen, and I can accentuate the images. So the question is, do I have some sort of way of looking at these and then really understanding specifically what do I have in terms of texture? With texture mapping, can we determine what a tumor is specifically, potentially what its outcomes are? We talk about things like radiomics, different information from the data set. And one of the things cinematic provides is really a way of thinking about the data that's a bit different than conventional wisdom. I think that becomes very important for us. I think we all spend a lot of time looking at images. And I've made this point before that I think just looking at your screen, you're just using 10-20% of the data. I think if you want to use 100% of the data, you're going to need to figure out ways of really getting into that data, displaying the data, understanding the data. One of the things I recognize from meetings like CES, I mentioned that I spoke about last week, or RSNA, or listening to lectures from companies like NVIDIA, is that the information in the data far exceeds the ability for us just to simply visually look at it. There's so much more data, and I think one of the reasons we miss things is because of our limitation as people being able to recognize subtle changes or being overwhelmed by the thousands of slices we have to look at. The good thing about computers, helping us is computers don't get tired. Computers don't take coffee breaks, and they don't take lunch. But truthfully, we don't take lunch or coffee breaks either. We just drink our coffee whenever there's time. And I can tell you from the taste of that coffee and from its temperature, that's about 2 hours, 37 minutes, and 42 seconds old, which means I got it like forever ago. I'll have to spill it out after the lecture. But I think, one of the things that we are looking at in CTisus is how we provide information, and we do strategize how we look at information. And those of you who come to our course in February will be talking about cinematic rendering and some of the other visualizations and how to implement it. It'll be interesting. I think a cinematic rendering, the end of the day, probably will be better cinematic, then there'll be more companies doing cinematic, and there'll be different ways of doing cinematic. The question is, do you embed cinematic inside AI applications? That will be an interesting thing, particularly if you can look at texture, then define specifically the texture and some of the important bits of information that come from there. I think that's a very real possibility. I think we need to look at that. Let me see now. A couple questions. Good morning, by the way, Daniel Lindberg. CTisus is coming to my hospital for a presentation tomorrow. What should I ask them in regard to workflow and scanner capability for cinematic rendering? I don't know. I think you ought to ask them what the best scanner you can afford is. A lot of new scanners. I think cinematic rendering is totally dependent on the data. So the better the scanner you have, the better the data, the better the rendering will be. And then, of course, you need to know how to use the scanner well. But the usual thing is, I think it's quality of data. Anything with post-processing is totally dependent on data. So I would ask them, how they envision your workflow at your hospital. I don't know if you're a small hospital, big hospital, there's one radiologist or 100 radiologists. You have a 3D lab, but the physicians or technologists do it. How do they look at workflow? So that's a good question. I think we've had this question before, is how do you look at things? How do you determine workflow, particularly the challenges that go around workflow? How do you manage the process is really an important thing to think about. And so it is a good question. I think one of the things that's interesting is Siemens Office Cinematic. To my knowledge, no one else does, and the question is, till when will that be? It seems like it's something that people, maybe they don't use it that much, they don't have it yet, but it seems that everybody seems to notice it. It's one of those things that tends to be very visible. And these days, where people not getting very excited about anything, you could run a 3-minute mile, people will yawn and say, well, a Jaguar can do that. But I think this is one of the things where people seem to be a little bit more engaged and a little bit more interested. So we'll have to see if that bears any fruit and whether or not we will see changes in this regard. So let's see, what else can I tell you about cinematic rendering? I guess when people ask me the challenges, I think the first challenge is the data set. Without quality data, whether it's volume rendering, classic, cinematic, or MIP, you're not going to get good quality. So importance of injection rate, particularly when looking at soft tissues, importance of arterial versus venous phase imaging. If you're doing musculoskeletal, again, I find that using the soft tissue algorithm for bone makes better 3D images than using the high-res bone algorithm. With the cinematic, with the high-res bone, the images still tend to be noisy, or at least the soft tissues become very noisy, so it is more problematic to me. But that may just be our experience. I think also you'll find that when you show this to referring clinicians, regardless of the app you show, there'll be very high acceptance. Even people who traditionally may not like or refer for 3D now want to get it. So in a sense, you need to be considering what your workflow is going to be, who's going to do this, how are you going to create the images, what's the upstream capabilities and capacity of your own institution. So that is going to be an issue. I always find that workflow questions are typically issues because people often aren't paying attention that much to their workflow and they just think things happen. And things, quite frankly, even at Hopkins, don't just happen. So I'm down to my last few seconds. If anyone has a final question, I'll be happy to answer it. Again, we do the Facebook Live every Wednesday at noontime. Sometimes we don't do it then because I'm away, but that's not that frequent. And so I guess we'll see you back here 7 days from now and 24 hours minus 15 minutes from now. And again, if you have any questions, you can answer them. We are posting a bunch of information. We have a bunch of articles published. You go to PubMed, you look at my name, you will see them. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.